Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. I'm back home, as you can tell by the slightly less exciting backdrop as before, but nice to be back nonetheless. But anyway, I wanted to talk a little bit about the final book that I've read from the Women's Prize shortlist, and that is The Sentence by Louise Erdrich. And I will go into a little bit of spoiler sort of territory later, but this early part should just be fairly spoiler free, so feel free to click off when that time comes and I'll announce it, but for the time being let's just talk a bit about this book. So obviously been nominated for the or shortlisted for the Women's Prize. Louise Erdrich is no stranger to prizes, having won the Pulitzer for The Night Watchman. And this book is my first time reading anything by Louise Erdrich, and I really did enjoy it. I think overall, sort of at times I occasionally got a little bit lost, but sort of the way it kind of came together at the end I really did appreciate. And so this is a book that is largely about books. One of the key characters in the book is a bookseller. I've said the word book too many times now in that one sentence. And there's a passage at the end of this book that is just full of book recommendations. And they are on quite specific lists, and sort of, you know, ones about ghosts or about indigenous history, or various other things. So it's quite a rich and varied book, but the key idea is that this is a book that largely reflects the current time, especially the last couple of years. So we have in this book talk of the pandemic, we have references to George Floyd, we have references to sort of civil unrest in America, sort of particularly after George Floyd, after the election, loads of other sort of things with that, and that's all tied into the story that is about, in some ways, about redemption. We have, you know, our central character Tookie, who has had some sort of again, without spoiling it, has had some sort of reason for why she's now very grateful to be working in a bookshop, and sort of has sort of changed her life and sort of turned bits around. But we also have these sort of interconnected family histories, and in many ways this book is, I think, aiming to sort of tell a bit of a story of America at the current time, not only through the kind of historical lens of all of the big things that have been happening really recently, but it also brings in, for example, indigenous history, and there are a few characters who are from who have sort of indigenous roots, and there's a really interesting discussion about sort of when are you indigenous enough, and, you know, all of these sorts of things, which is a, you know, a really hot button issue for many indigenous people, particularly when it comes to laws around and sort of rules and regulations around blood quotas and all these sorts of things. So the book kind of handles that quite deftly and quite sort of subtly, whilst also talking about these wider pictures. And so in some ways this feels like a very American novel in a way that I think normally that label can sometimes sort of scare me, but actually I think this book handles that really quite cleverly, because there is a key story at the heart of this that's interesting, but ultimately is dealing with sort of the wider ramifications of history. It's also worth noting that a kind of a key part of this also features a sort of ghost story, and that is also this idea of the trails of history sort of popping up in current life and in the current day. So really interesting and really exciting to see how this is all handled. And I also just really love Erdrich's writing style. There's something so punchy about it. It reminds me a lot of the things I like about Anne Patchett and Anne Tyler. Not to compare authors, but there's a kind of a lightness of touch and a sort of humour and warmth to their characters that I really love in those other two authors' works, and I found really engaging about this book as well. And I think just overall really glad to see this on the shortlist. I'm going to go a little bit into spoiler territory in a second, but I do recommend it. I think it's a good, fun book. I say fun despite the subject matter not always being particularly fun, but there's a lot of quite funny back and forth between characters, and it's very much a reader's book as well. You know, this sort of real love of literature and of reading and of the power of stories kind of comes through so much of this. Not always perfect for me, sometimes got a little bit lost, sometimes felt a little bit like the beginning needed a bit of setting up, but overall I think a really worthy book, and makes me really want to go and check out more of Erdrich. Anyway, on to some quick spoilers in just a moment. So, as I mentioned, there are ghosts that appear in this book in some form, and the form that that really does take is around this sort of lineage of history of essentially a woman trying to be part of other people's lives. And what I thought was really interesting about this, it was this sort of the parallels that this book then tries to strike between, you know, what's happened in the past and how that has echoes in the current time, but also how the whole notion of ancestors and who they are and what they do and what they bring is so core also to the American story, that this idea of our forebears did this whole thing beforehand and have created the circumstances for us to live in, but actually sometimes those circumstances also involve some real sort of collective trauma as a nation or as a people, and particularly Louise Erdrich writing as a Native American or Indigenous author is a really big part of that as well. There's sort of that's woven in to the story, and particularly how this book talks about other books is also particularly relevant because there is a key book in this that is seen as having some sort of magical power or is sort of somehow foretelling things, and there are parallels drawn between the idea of passing things along down history through words, and also how in during the pandemic, bookshops after a sort of short period of time were announced as essential, as really essential parts of the world, and as a result, that is a really important thing, that actually if they are seen as essential businesses, that people need bookshops to be open during a pandemic. What does that say about reading? What does that say about books? And in fact, what that really does seem to say about books is the power of stories, the importance of empathy, the importance of reading and sort of connecting with other people and their lives and hearing other perspectives. And that's something this book kind of aims to do. And although I don't think it's always as I maybe didn't always fall in love with it in quite the same way that I might some other books, I did find this immensely readable and immensely entertaining and interesting. And so I think that us watching the trials and tribulations of a character like Tookie, who especially we hear of, has the part of the sentence of the title is around a jail sentence, and actually the idea of redemption and turning one's life around is really pivotal to this book as well. So really interesting, and I found that there was a lot to love and a lot to find really interesting in this book, and I'm really keen, to read more of hers. Would love to hear thoughts in the chat on anything else you'd really recommend by her, but also just any thoughts about this book itself. I've been Bob, talking about this book, the final one on my Women's Prize shortlist, and I will now be doing a separate video on the shortlist altogether. So I've been Bob, take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.